a small chant that comes to us from our own wisdom network, ever-flowing, unchanging one. And as you hear it and join it, throw in any harmonies that seem to want to arise. Ever-flowing, unchanging one. 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 I'd like to pick up, as we start round 2 this morning, just touching base on what may be a technicality, but I think that it's an important enough technicality that it needs assent or a little input from this group, confirmation, and then I want to move back into the main thread of where I heard us winding up as of last time. So this matter of true self, false self, it seems that Thomas has been working increasingly in his teaching toward the end on 2 levels with the use of this term. And this is one of the things that those of us that are carrying forward the legacy within the Christian tradition, and specifically within the contemplative outreach container, need to be aware of. So I want to check it out. In his original iteration of the teaching, he developed the model of true self, false self, using very much models of psychology, Piaget in particular. And the full self, or the homemade self, became essentially his version of the neurotic, wounded self, the self that was formed around the emotional wounds of a lifetime to protect and shield from our injuries in the basic areas of power, control, esteem, affection, and security and survival. So the false self was, in a sense, the neurotic self, giving the impression, which I think is still very, very prominently a part of the teaching and is in some sense true at that level, that the true self is essentially then what we call in psychological terms high egoic functioning. In other words, it's our sense of created selfhood, our natural endowments, virtues, joie de vivre, no longer encumbered by our attached baggage. So it definitely has form and identity and substance. Toward the end of his life, and I think germinating and percolating as one of the real shared insights in his InterSpiritual non-dual circle, if I'm hearing correctly, the false self becomes increasingly for Thomas any form of constructed selfhood. Mentally constructed, emotionally constructed, any sort of substantial point of reference. And for him then, the true self, if he uses the term at all within this last transformation of his life, becomes the point of no reference, the self that has no face, the self that is the sliver that doesn't come up anymore. So it becomes, for him, true self is certainly converging closer and closer to what would traditionally be called no self. And I think this is a knowing that essentially took place and shape during the last, particularly 5 years of his life, and was germinated basically within his InterSpiritual container and is not widely yet promulgating out into his teaching. So I just wondered if you could offer me confirmation or clarification on that before we move on, because it will be an important point going forward. Does that seem like that's so to you, or any? Yeah, Swami.
Just one brief comment, and that is that I remember Tom from the mid-90s. Like this, it still doesn't, it's not...
It's not.
It's okay. I remember from the mid-90s, Tom talking about the false self and about the no self. In fact, that time, which I referred to earlier, when he said, I don't know if this is good Catholic doctrine. In fact, I don't know if it's Catholic doctrine at all. Then he went on to say that now I experience the sense of self melting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was even in the 90s.
Even in the 90s, yes.
Yeah.
So it might have become, and certainly I agree with your, the main point is that that idea went on developing with him. Mm-hmm. But the seeds of it I saw even in the mid-90s.
Great, thank you. You have the comments? Rory?
I'm not quite sure what to say about it in terms of the end of Thomas's life. It just strikes me now. I mean, he had certainly written about and taught a lot about a false self, and then a dark night, and becoming a true self, and then a further dark night where you become no self. So that's in his writings and stuff, and he would actually postulate a further dark night, a further process of letting go of the true self. And just as I'm sitting with it now, I don't really have much to say, but it's interesting to think about that. I mean, because he wrote that years before, and then in terms of the end part of his life, this just kind of continuing journey.
Yeah.
I don't even think we can posit an end of a sort of no self. I mean, and maybe part of that is taking on suffering of the world and this embodied quality that just continually incarnates. But, you know, it's like there was something still, he was always exploring and on the edge, even though he talked about this stuff in terms of stages and stuff earlier in his life. Yeah.
Cynthia, is this working? Yep. It's very unfair of you to bring this up and give us just a few minutes to get it out of the way.
Yeah,
This,
right, yeah.
I mean, we could
All right, yep,
have a whole weekend on this, couldn't we?
yeah.
But let me just say a few words. I'm not sure. Are we hearing okay?
Yeah, it's good now.
All right. You can hear me though. I speak up. What Rory says about stages upon stages of the dissolving and reformation of the self may be the actual journey that the soul is capable of, because after all, it's an infinite journey. But there are stages in this journey where one encounters the absolute, and like the stars in daylight, the stars disappear. Doesn't mean they're not there. But in the presence of the absolute, the experience is, I'm not there. And in some traditions see this as a temporary state, or as a passing state. I think a really significant question that really deserves to be asked is, what is the purpose of being human? Mm-hmm. Is it to become no self?
Yeah.
Is that the highest attainment? Yeah. Would my children like me more if I were no self? For instance.
Yeah.
Sometimes, sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Depends which self we're comparing it with. Or is there a purpose? Is there a divine purpose in individuality? Mm-hmm. And what is the potential of individuality to embody, to encompass the divine reality, the spiritual qualities in a self that has dissolved and reformed and dissolved and reformed, and grows into a being that is able to manifest a full spectrum of qualities, not all of them necessarily sweet and subtle, some of them powerful and rigorous. So I think it's such an important question.
Yeah. Beautiful.
I'm just bringing it up.
No, thank you for that, because we're naming something very, very real here, and again, this fundamental East-West understanding is the idea to get out of the planet and to dissolve like the star into the absolute, or is it a post that we hold to bear form and individuality in this life anyway, for the sake of something else emerging?
Something about a kiss with matter. That spirit is continually manifesting through everything visible and also the invisible. And you mentioned earlier too the question of including all of creation, and the light that dances on the leaves and in our hearts. That as human beings, we have that capacity to witness and to stand on that threshold between the worlds. And something about the way that Thomas was able to hold that place, for so many people, that the self is that point of the kiss of the beloved, that can just open up when one recognizes that place in oneself. One can become that doorway for everyone, for everything, to have that flowing.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Justin?
So Thomas and I often talked about Bernadette Roberts' early works, and particularly her work on no self. And also, since I studied theology, we talked about no self and theology. And I can remember him talking about no self and wondering if it was meant for this world, for everyone. But for some, probably. And that was the point of, for purgatory, for for those who didn't make that part of the journey here, they make it on the way to the next. You can do your homework on the bus. But when individuality comes in, I mean, to my knowledge, Thomas never liked fish. And at the end of his life, he still didn't like fish, as far as I know. So, whatever self was left, if there was self left, he still don't like fish.
There's the T-shirt. Yeah.
I just wanted to confirm, based on my conversations with him, what you said, that he, at the end of his life, the last conversations I had with him, definitely equated the true self with the constructed self. And just prefacing that, I've always thought that there's nothing more reinforcing of the true self or the self in Buddhism than talking about losing it. But at the risk of that, I think it's important to recognize that, certainly from a Buddhist perspective, self has nothing to do with individuality. It has to do with clinging and constructing, so that if you think of self more as a verb than a noun, it's something that we're in the process of continually creating and then recognizing and letting it drop away. It doesn't mean that our personalities drop away or our preferences drop away. What drops away is our clinging to those preferences. The Buddha is famously quoted as saying, nothing whatsoever should be clung to as I or mine. And I think that really encapsulates that particular view of it.
Beautiful, thank you. So just to double check, since it will be on video, you said when you said he equated the true self with the constructed self, did you mean that, or did you mean he equated the false self with the constructed?
I'm sorry, yes.
Good.
Absolutely.
Good, because we gotta.
Absolutely. I
Excellent.
misspoke.
All right. Thank you. I think that's a real burst of insight that could only have come from this circle, from all of you putting this together. And I acknowledge, Kabir and Camille, your right topic, your right thing, that this is really an underlying topic that's going under this whole thing, underneath oneness, underneath everything we're about to do and about where we're going to segue is the question of what is self then? Is self something that has any sort of permanent being, validity, or is it something that we assume in this world in order to serve for the purpose of love? These questions are percolating. I want, as we move into the sort of designated topic for the second section, to start by saying that what came up rather surprisingly and powerfully at the end of the last session was the number of you who talked of Thomas's suffering at the end. Suffering in both physical suffering and spiritual suffering, certainly. And with the implication that there was something carried here that was more than just, to jump into my stupid understanding of Buddhist terms, his individual karma. That there was something that he was carrying here that was of a bodhisattva-like nature, or as the Christians would say, of a paschal nature. And that was affirmed by so many of you that I think that's a really important point. And it bears some it has some really strong implication for where we go next. Because as a realized or realizing master takes on the cosmic task of carrying something of the collective pain body of all sentient beings, that implies a placement in the greater cosmic scheme of things that has some extraordinary and absolutely practical relevance for how we, as a group of his students, his beloveds, his mershis, do our work now. Many of the traditions speak, some in ornate detail, of the worlds beyond the worlds, of the realms beyond the realms, of the struggles to attain these realms, and of the assistance that can be offered once these realms are attained. They speak also of what we, as the earth pole of this transmission, what's required of us to stay attuned to an energy of transmission that's more subtle, certainly than the stuff that our planet acknowledges as pertinent. So my interest in the next hour is to ascertain what sort of collective wisdom we have in the room about that, and what your individual sense is of where Thomas is, what this kind of deep purgatory that he went through before his death, where that might have landed him on the other side, if you can even go there to speculate, and how we move forward, taking up what Kabir and Camille have spoken about so beautifully, the privilege and in some sense, the honor of bearing form so that love may be manifest. How do we receive help that's being offered and not miss in our grief real, ongoing partnership? So, floor is open.
Just talking to David after that, and it seemed like that in this configuration, suffering is a necessary condition for oneness. And suffering in this sense, not only for one's own pain, but compassion, with suffering of others. That somehow that's on the path to oneness. So there's no there's nothing that, they're not antithetical, they're necessary. And we see that in all the different traditions, in a way. So within the Buddhist context, that compassion is a necessary condition for enlightenment. And it's a necessary condition for one's own happiness and well-being and nirvana. And so without it, we don't get there. So that's all.
Yeah, I wanted to just return a little bit to this question about the post-Christian aspect, and it carries on from what Cynthia just said, that there are implications to this understanding about the self at the individual level, and then what reflects that at the global and cosmic level. And the shift in mainstream science as of 2015 in a book that redefined the foundational questions of science, and the first one was natural selection, was that in any complex system, and absolutely in any system that involves conscious choice, nature, which would be evolutionary process, chooses that which serves the whole, not that which serves the individual. So it chooses cooperation as opposed to competition. So again, David Sloan Wilson, in his latest book, it's interesting, the title of which is Completing the Darwinian Revolution. And he announces at the beginning that it's a statement, it's a restatement to the mainstream scientific community of Teilhard de Chardin's cosmology. And so if we look at post as not meaning after, but meaning a deeper continuation of, actually what David Sloan Wilson is saying, that mainstream science, even not adopting any theological words or narratives, needs to absolutely see that the cosmology that was laid out by Teilhard is actually the one that's consistent with evolutionary process. And that's huge, because he asked the question, could any species survive very long on this planet if the way it was operating was actually the opposite of how evolutionary process works? So the subtitle then is Completing the Darwinian Revolution. It's interesting. The title is This View of Life, and that is a quote in the last paragraph of The Origin of Species by Darwin. Darwin says, everybody in this room will get this, there is grandeur to this view of life. There is grandeur to this view of life. And then he refers to looking out at a natural landscape and seeing the wisdom of the interrelationships in that. So last thing to mention then is there's a film that's been done about this big transition, because the Harvard establishment, particularly E.O. Wilson, had to get on board with this shift. And they asked David, why did you stick with group selection and multi-level selection, which is where the data sets prove that natural selection chooses what serves the whole? Why did you stick with that when that was absolute heresy and certainly could have ruined a career? And David says, it's amazing, and this goes back to what we were saying about the self and the heart and the individual. He said, any other view to me was counterintuitive to how I felt as a human being. And also my relation to nature when I was a child. That it was so obvious that nature was not just about this, but it was about this. And so what the last part of that then is that the Dalai Lama found out about all this and then has invited David to go sit with him for 2 afternoons in October, November to discuss the implications of science taking this turn. Last thing I'll say, it's a huge surprise to me in the straddle between science and spirituality that such a main ally to the journey we're talking about would come from mainstream reductionist science simply based on data sets. That to me is amazing. But this is a huge turnaround. And I remember mentioning this to Thomas in the sense that instead of us all doing our work with the wind at our face, because people were telling us evolution is actually about this, it's not about what your heart is telling you, but to actually know that the wind is at our back in the view of evolutionary process is just an incredible sea change. So I just wanted to make sure we were all aware of this grand change in science.
In our tradition, meaning specifically in the Ramakrishna tradition, rather than speaking for the whole Hindu tradition, but in our tradition we say that suffering without meaning, which means also suffering without understanding, suffering without meaning, is just suffering. But suffering with meaning, with a higher purpose, is no longer just suffering. Yes, there may still be pain. You may still see that the person is suffering, but it's not just suffering. The suffering becomes the less important part of it. If there's suffering with a deeper meaning, then suffering becomes transformative. And that really was one of the great insights of the Christian tradition, or illustrated by the life of Christ himself. That suffering with meaning, with a purpose, with a higher purpose, is no longer just suffering. People ask in context of the Bodhisattva's vow, or in our tradition of taking on suffering of other people, my suffering is so heavy I can't even bear my own suffering. How could I take on the suffering of another? How could I suffer for other people? But that fails to understand the dynamic at work. In our text, there's this ancient saying from the Upanishads, Nalpe sukhamasti bhumaiva sukham, that there is no happiness in the small, in the limited, in the individual, in the limited sense of limitation. Only the vast is happy. And so even suffering, if it becomes big, then it no longer has that same quality, destructive quality. It has an illuminating quality. And so finally, I wanted to bring one other strand into this question of suffering, and that is coming back to the sense of self and no self. That the self, as we usually experience, and I'm speaking in terms that are meaningful from my tradition, but I think that it's in harmony with everything I heard from Father Tom. And it helps me to understand his growth and experience. That the ordinary constructed self, the false self, is like a closed door that closes us off from the world around us. It isolates us. It makes us small and cut off from reality, cut off from other people, cut off from the world, cut off from God. Through the spiritual transformation, the door begins to become a window in which we can see a larger expanse. And then the self is no longer something which is just obstructive, but it becomes something which is communicative, which becomes transparent and allows light to come through. But eventually the self should become a door. A window is still a separation. You can see outside, but there's still glass there. There's me, and there's the beautiful outside world, which I can enjoy from the vantage point of my window. But eventually the window should become a door which no longer separates. Depending on my experience in the moment, that is internal experience, I may be experiencing through the self, but no longer cut off from the world. And there are times when I walk outside the door and the little self has been left behind. But that I can then work from within inside the door or outside the door. It's no longer a limitation.
So Thomas would invite us in the Snowmass dialogues to speak, not just from our tradition, but from our experience. And so I'm reflecting on my own experience of selfhood and suffering. And it seems to me that in my practice, I can come into a state of just non-identified presence, just love, pure loving presence, in which I have no identity, I have no label, I have no name, in some sense I have no tradition. I'm just loving awareness. And then I have to go about living in the world, and that loving awareness refracts through the unique, intricate individuality of this form and this body. And I find in that heart-centered awareness, I'm staking a new center of selfhood that isn't my mental selfhood and that isn't my emotional selfhood, but that is spacious, open presence. And in that, I experience myself simultaneously in two ways. I experience myself as held in this infinite heart, and I experience myself as the heart in which I am held. And so I am this infinite open heart that's holding this, and I am this held in that. And it seems to me that incarnate selfhood is a continual dance between those two, that there's this individuality and that, and that it needs to always be both. Rumi says that expansion and contraction are like the two wings of a bird. You need both to fly. And so if I'm always in that expanded state, I'm probably not much use here. And if I'm always in that contracted state, I'm also probably not much use here. But it's that in the constant beating heart or dance between being that heart which holds all things and being that which is held in that heart, that God's unfolding continues. So where suffering comes in, well, it depends on which moment of the heartbeat I'm in as I'm encountering suffering. But suffering, it seems to me, it's just part of the conditions of being incarnate. It's just part of the deal. And if I'm in the contracted state, just identified with that, suffering can just be a nightmare. If I'm in something that's more permeable, suffering can become a doorway to sweetness, a doorway to humility. I find sometimes my back really painfully goes out, and then I have to get around on a walker, and I have to ask for help, and it could be just a horribly contracting thing, but I find it can open me to sweetness and humility and open me outward. And so, and in that, it's not just my suffering. I think when you're in the smaller state, it's my suffering. And when you're in the wider state, it's suffering. It's just part of the boundary conditions of living in finitude. And you can let that be all suffering can be a doorway into opening or a doorway into closing. And so I don't know that suffering is necessary for awakening. Suffering is just part of the process of being in a body. But we can wield it for either possibility. I don't want to say it's necessary. I think there are some people who are very open who maybe aren't encountering lots of physical or emotional suffering. But it changes our relationship to it, depending on the level of selfhood we're identified or non-identified with. And so for me, it seems the journey, and what I see in Thomas, or saw in Thomas, is that journey towards increasingly being rooted in non-identified presence. So you're in selfhood that has no fixed point of reference. It's just, I keep hearing, as people talked about this earlier, Hildegard Mechthild's phrase, the flowing light of the Godhead, and that self is a flowing light. It isn't a fixed, constructed thing. It's just a flowing light. So it's, I mean, at that point, self, no self, what does it matter? You're that flowing presence. But it flows through this thing that doesn't like fish or that has likes and dislikes. And we dance back and forth.
Justin, I think, had the mic next. Nicholas? I don't know. Okay, good.
just to speak to that, I think the idea of the particular and the universal come together in the relationship between the particular in the transformation of consciousness. And I like this idea of emotional photosynthesis, that each of us has our own particular circumstances in life that is absolutely unique to each of us. We all have it coming towards us. And that the meaning that we have in life is to take those circumstances and take the suffering that is within those circumstances, whatever that may be, and transform that suffering into love. And like in plant photosynthesis, where it's all taken out and oxygen is given out, our role is to take the circumstances of our lives, to experience the suffering, and as Richard Rohr said, not to transmit it, but to transform it through that emotional photosynthesis. So, therefore, each of us, our individual suffering, therefore has meaning, because it is a part of the transformation of consciousness. And through the role, through our emotional photosynthesis, we connect with everybody else, and we are part of that transformation of all consciousness.
I remember this kind of piggybacks. I'm glad you went in between. There are three things about suffering when I think about Thomas. Closer. There are three things when I think about Thomas and suffering that come to mind immediately. The first is, many of you know he broke his neck in a car wreck. So he had physical pain. And I remember we were at some sort of meeting. I think it was like centering prayer and 12-step. And he talked about physical pain. And then he said, in the morning when I wake up, I'm in such serious pain that I can't fathom getting out of bed. And then above me, I see Our Lady, and her hands are out, and we press our hands together, and then I can get up. So that's, to me, when I heard that, there's that kind of imaginal practice of interacting with the saints, particularly the Virgin Mary. And so later on, I started to have not the same kind of pain experience, but experience of Our Lady. And I went in to talk with him about it. And he says, well, I'm going to try not to do my impersonations of Thomas.
Please do.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I just went on a little tirade with him about, I'm having this experience of the Virgin Mary. And as oftentimes when I thought this was, this is going to be so good, this is going to be, finally some progress. And he says, well, it is even better if you have the experience of no experience of Our Lady. All right. So, now the thing was, like 15 years earlier, he was pressing his hands to the imaginal presence of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And then later he's telling, so you know what I'm saying. So at least there's a little continuity and evolution in Thomas's relationship to the Virgin Mary, which goes way, way back. The other thing about suffering is, I was once with Thomas, and we were checking in and catching up, and he mentioned that he was experiencing a lot of suffering, and it was not his. And so he started to talk about the Beguines, I think which it was years ago, so I'm a little foggy. But he would talk about this one time in particular, how we are called to take on the suffering of the whole world and the whole universe and just let it be healed in our bodies. And this was a time when he clearly was in a lot of suffering. And it seemed like, he may have been at least encouraging me at that moment to recognize that as part of our vocation. Not just as an individual practice, but to consent to taking on the suffering of the entire cosmos.
Justin, just a question, and this is coming back to something that Rory interested me in too. One of Thomas's teachings about that deeper purification of the false self, he talks about taking on the collective, the purification of the collective unconscious and the collective forces. I'm hearing that for the first time in the light of what you guys are saying is essentially his way of talking about that cosmic suffering, that bodhisattva dimension, that the collective suffering is not just the lower left and lower right quadrants of the AQUAL model, but is something really deeply, he's talking about Tonglen basically without naming it such. Do you think that's true?
So when we talked about it, he made the point many times. This is a deeper, a deeper conformity to Christ. Mm-hmm. And sometimes he didn't use the imitation of Christ language with me very often. Mm-hmm. Conformity to Christ, consent to being buried with Christ, mm-hmm. and dying with Christ. And I oftentimes had questions about who is doing the suffering. And at some points, Christ is the one suffering, mm-hmm. in me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Got it.
To pick up what you were saying, Justin, about Thomas talking to Mary and then kind of letting that go. My first visit, when I arrived at Spencer, topic was talking to Jesus. And it was funny because I'd never asked him about that. It was more, letting go of self, of centering prayer, but not what your relationship is with Jesus. So I asked him, I said, Thomas, do you talk to Jesus? And he says, I talk to Jesus every day. I ask Jesus every detail, because if not, I would just be talking to myself. So he really stressed that point of speaking with Jesus.
Okay, I want to try and say something. Let's see if it'll come out. I'm such a feeler, and so I feel these things in my body, and often I struggle to find the words. But I want to refer back to my last visit with Thomas that I referenced last evening, where a few of us had gathered with him, and he was discussing this process of dying and that it's the hardest work of his life. And this transmission that happened with our group in his presence, I think this is what interests me, is the path that he took, which was one of suffering and self-emptying, made him this portal of such life-giving, transformational power that we've all been touched by. And so this is what interests me in terms of like, how do I follow that path? Because it's that transformational power and essence coming through one who is broken and open and willing to endure whatever pain and suffering that requires, that allows for, that healing transformational power to come through us for the collective, for the whole, which is what we experienced as a collective body with him. And to me, this is hope for the cosmic, universal, global healing that we're all wanting to see. So how do we become that? That's what I want to pursue.
Yeah, beautiful.
There was something in what you said about the relationship with Jesus and relationality as a whole to the evolutionary instinct of wholeness and whole-making that I think sort of ensconces suffering into something that has to do with tension, which is the point of relationality, the point of relationship, which is I am not you, I am not other than you. And that necessary eye of the needle that seems to be this reality of tension, whether the tension is experienced as suffering or profound pleasure, friction, energy, the necessary way that our world is held up. And the relationality of how this world is held up. That through this tension is great creativity and life and joy, anguish, all of it together, that makes more life and more life and more life. And so, to the question of the other worlds, to that intuitive sense that we had in our hearts all along, evolution must be on this track toward creating more wholeness, and here now finally it's confirmed. Of course there are other worlds, of course. Now science is confirming some of it, how many dimensions there are, multiverse, whatever. But if relationality is the inherent structure of this universe, it probably is true of the whole thing as well. And so the permeability between realms feels kind of obvious. But last night, Will and Cynthia and I were talking about how strange it is that we don't talk about how real that is. Or we feel sheepish to talk about it because in a way it can sound as though we're, trying to elevate a magical thinking of specialness. Oh, I was visited by the, whatever, saint or anything. When really I think it's quite ordinary. The other side is very real. The assistance is very tangible. And the relationality is in service toward what we are making together, both in this world and the other worlds together. So that great kind of cosmic unfolding that we're in together, I think that landing down into accepting the constraints of tension and relationality and working with it in service to creativity. That feels like it's landing in my heart.
So, before I say anything, I want to say what an honor I feel of being here.
Alex, speak right like this.
Before anything, I want to say how deep honor I feel of being here among you. So thank you. As I said yesterday, my relationship with the teacher, with Thomas Keating, was not in person. In person was really very small. But I followed him since that movie, through books, through the internet, through whatever means, and through subtitling his words. And he sometimes appeared in dreams. And talking about suffering, there was this particular very short dream in which I was part of a circle, and there was this wild crying and desperation outside the circle, wars, people in tremendous pain, animals in pain. It seemed like the whole world was in pain. And in the circle, we were just in prayer, in silent prayer. And then he came to me and he said, the pain of the world can only be healed through our human body, through each person's human body. That was it. But it felt that is all that you had spoken about somehow.
Okay.
I was just going to ask Cynthia, are we on topic? I mean, we're on a beautiful topic.
Yeah, we're on topic. This is where it wants to go.
Okay.
So I was just sitting here thinking of Thomas sitting in the circle with us in the semi-empty chair, absent of devices over there, or the empty chairs back here. So, yeah, there you go. Bree, I just appreciate the ordinary. And in my own life of people who have died, of my relationship with them after they pass, and realizing that it's quite ordinary. In some ways, it's just learning, and I'm a baby in it, learning how to be in relationship in this different form. And I was thinking with Thomas sitting here, he would say, oh, come on, y'all. I'm just sitting here. I'm very ordinary in some ways, because I witnessed that. I experienced that with him often. If we put him too high on a pedestal or made it too magical or whatever, he'd just bring us right back, or me right back down. And with his suffering, I experienced that too throughout the years, but then also in the last few months of his life. And him as my teacher in how to be with my own personal suffering in whatever way, physical suffering and that of the world, continued even up to the last visit or the last time with him, of how he would, when we visited him last time, he had pulled a muscle in his arm or wrist and he was in extreme pain with lifting it, but he still was with us. He mentioned the pain, and every time he moved, it was there. But just that very ordinary way of being in some ways in his body, and yet practicing to the very end of how to bring that and transmit it, as everyone has been speaking of, you know. And so he was, I think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama of saying, you know, I'm a beginner on the path. I'm on the path with all of you. And I want to bring that in.
Yeah.
That Thomas is on the path. He's right here with us, and in the ordinary, in the relational.
Perfect.
So that question, Cynthia, that you brought up about the realms and where beings may be, that was really on my mind when I was in Bhutan, and we went into dialogue about that. And And certain beings, they go to certain realm or levels, and they're actually doing very specific things. And you could get in touch with these beings by getting yourself in the right configuration, and they're doing very specific things for you and for the world. It just makes me wonder what realm Thomas is in, and what is his unique role right now, and how could we get in the right configuration, which we are now, to really receive that. There's extensive instruction in the Buddhist tradition, but very limited in the Christian tradition, on how to work with beings. So I'm just raising that question. And
I'd like to jump off on that if I can. Do I need the mic to do that, or am I already mic'd?
You're mic'd.
Okay, because I think this is exactly the gateway that was in the back of my mind in my heart when we pulled this together. And I realize now that we've also been talking for a little over an hour, and I'm torn between pushing on or taking a break with the risk of losing it. So let me summarize what I think we're hovering on the cusp of, and the group can decide itself what it wants to do with this. I think that we've had a wonderful conversation about how we understand that Thomas's taking on of conscious suffering has created a powerful placement, a powerful selfhood, and we've talked about that. And a couple of you towards the end, Bree and Felina in particular, picked up on what Kurt threw out right at the beginning, which is the evolutionary aspect of this, that somehow this is kicking the planet forward. And I think that what you said in your feeling heart, Felina, and what you said in your thinking heart, Bree, about how this tension of relationality, this tension of the whole, which registers on us subjectively as suffering, is actually an alchemical, life-giving force. Nicholas talked about photosynthesis, that's kicking something forward, which has a direct implication for how the world moves forward and gets over this next evolutionary cusp. And I believe that, like it or not, we're very sort of pivotally positioned as this group of Thomas students to facilitate that, cooperate with that, and most important, not let it drain. That out in the world, we're looking at total hopelessness. We're looking at the domination of secular models that we know don't work. We've relegated suffering to a neurosis and a private affair. We simply don't have any language for talking about, that's probably my cell phone, but it rings once a month when I'm talking, that we have no language to draw on it, even the Teilhardian concepts of hope, because this is going somewhere, that it's not going somewhere unsupported by the cosmos. All these models are unknown in the culture. And so we watch, I watch my grandkids, struggling with the end of their world is getting into an Ivy League college or dying of anorexia because it's just the world is too scary. And so the question that I sense is that Thomas, you never use this language exactly. I mean, he'd shoot you right down and maybe, get Justin to do the Thomas, my dear, that to get it too highfalutin. And you're absolutely right, Cynthia. But that there is something that a burden he accepted, something he took on, that led to the unusual circumstances of the length and difficulty of his death, that's available to us as a sort of anchor point in a world from which help needs to flow into this realm. And how we language that, honor it, articulate it outward, and support it, I think is the conversation that can't even be had in this world. But it needs to be had here and now. And I wonder, first of all, if you're willing to continue on the veins of that conversation, or whether that's just my own thing working. And second, whether we need a break first before we can do it, and then come back and do that for a few minutes, or do we want to just let that one hang? Yeah.
Can I interject?
Sure.
And say we need to be out of here, all stuff out of here by 12:25.
12:25. Okay, good. Good, that will work.
And we have a third session to deal with.
Yeah, and they may just all meld into, I mean, I'm already seeing that the panels are going to have different shape than what they do, and I'll take a break at some point when we have the next thing and sit down and try and filter this through and come back with a proposal that we can decide on collectively. So, yeah, Kabir, what's your sense? Who's got a mic?
I think we've given a lot of discussion to suffering, the redemptive suffering that Thomas appears to have experienced. But something that I've noticed since being with you all, getting to know more of you, is that in a way you're all people who have graduated from something. That there's been movement from one understanding of faith, from one context of life, the understanding of life, to another context. And that much of humanity is being held back, you might even say imprisoned, in false concepts, in limited concepts, in concepts that no longer serve the whole. And traditionally this movement, it's almost a movement from exoteric to esoteric. That's one way to conceive of it. I don't know if that exactly explains it today, but is there some experience that this group can share to clarify what this movement is? That if there is going to be, insofar as our individual work and life's purpose is in some way related to the collective, and here we have representatives of people who have, in a sense, some sense, graduated to another consciousness, to another level of consciousness. What can we say about that to further this understanding? I also believe that whatever understanding that we achieve here, now, today, this weekend, is not just for us. Just as the suffering redeems the collective suffering, a breakthrough in understanding, a clarification of understanding here at this level with this small group of people also has immense implications. That it goes out because there is a sense in which we are one. We are collectively, we share mind and with all of humanity. And if the clarity of this awakening can be strengthened, articulated, then it has the possibility of having a large effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
This one is working.
They're all working.
Both.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a short comment on this idea of connecting to higher beings. This is just my understanding, and from reading esoteric literature, and also from what my teacher taught me, which is that these higher beings are always working with us. And it's not necessary that we are aware of it. So if one has connected to the depths of their own heart and is actually then engaged in some practical form of serving others, that is noticed and is supported by some of the higher beings in some way. And when one has brilliant ideas or certain breakthroughs, that may all have been made possible by higher beings, of which the person who has the breakthrough has no awareness whatsoever. Now, I'm not denying what you're saying, and I think it's a very profound threshold for us to cross into, which is to make conscious connection and to develop that skill and to begin to impart that as a fundamental part of the science of the heart, which is, to me, where the new real breakthrough in science will come, is in the esoteric science, which is a part of the science of consciousness. It's going into the infinity of the heart and exploring that inward cosmos with a kind of a scientific rigor and discipline. But part of that will be this conscious connecting to these beings. But I just wanted to say that they are operating even with people who are not aware of it. And when people have, deep insights, they're often coming from another plane. And they're impressed upon that person who then turns it into a thought and puts it out as my idea. But it's actually coming from these higher beings.
And it's not as if these aren't already within us. So we don't necessarily have to posit the existence of all these things. From a scientific perspective, evolutionary perspective, from the limitless potential of our own consciousness, these capacities exist within us, and it's our job to access, to learn how to be introduced to them and to use them. So it seems like the job, I see this kind of flow. You originally called this holding post, and so we're in a suffering world. So what is our job? What's the paradigm shift that we're talking about in terms of our recognition, working with suffering to find this unity of consciousness so that they're not antithetical one from the other? And then if we do stick with a third session somewhere like you were thinking, that okay, so how do we do that? So what are the kind of programs, writings, work that we're going to do together that recognizes everything that we've been saying and then puts it into action in some way? So it all has a nice flow to it. We define the unitive, we've talked about the suffering and the relationship with, and now we talk about, all right, so what are we going to do together?
Yeah, it's downloading.
Maybe that's too concrete, but that's just me.
It's downloading.
Let me see a little piece on this if I can.
Yeah.
Thinking about the practical, Kabir, when I started to have to study minor exorcisms and all this kind of stuff, I went to Thomas because Thomas didn't talk about any of this sort of thing, to my knowledge. And so, one of the things he started to talk about was, it's good to say masses for the dead and, give a little pointers here, and then moving on the unquiet dead. So folks who have died and don't know they're dead, and they continue to hang out in their old places. They need to be reminded that they're dead so they can move on to greener pastures. And so some of the advice he gave me was, don't make friends with these ghosts. Do your job and then move on. Don't get wrapped up in it. And I was, wow, well that's helpful. Same thing went with exorcism. So there was and this might have been just personal instruction for me, but just in the sense of, he didn't want me to make a big deal about any of it. Yes, there are ghosts. Help them out, and get on with your day. You got laundry to do. but also recognizing that it was a really profound ministry, particularly for the dead and the folks whose house they were messing around in. So anyway, for what that's worth, there are a few instructions from Thomas on some of the imaginal.
Perfect, perfect. And it's 11:30. I want to channel Rami for 1 minute, and that I know that one of the most beautiful stories that he told, one of the most riveting stories he told during our times at Spiritual Paths, was the old bit of Yiddish doggerel that the universe is held in orbit at any given time by 36 conscious human beings. And they don't know that, they don't know the other 35, and they don't know if they're one of the 36. But it's so in a sense, that means they're all working in complete nothingness, not with self-importance. But the quality of the presence, of the work they do, of the way they align themselves, is of such sufficient strength that it really creates a palpable field in which the exchange of help and transmission and life-giving force can continue. And I continue to have the sense that not so much out of personal self-glorification, which is to take it to the wrong place, but out of the sense of cosmic service for what's needed right now. Humankind is dying on the vine for the lack of ability to access the fundamental hope that lies embedded in that question that Kabir raised. What are we here for? What is our purpose? And in that question lies the meaning, the transformation, the relationship, the life. And since our institutions have been so co-opted with this kind of postmodern skepticism and alienation and timorousness to speak out the truth of the help of the good, the true, and the beautiful, almost the greatest act of courage in the world is to speak that and to live it. And how that's created, I don't know, but I feel that I feel so strongly in myself that it's one of the fundamental obligations or invitations that Thomas left for those who walked with him in this journey in a particular way, to say, okay, you guys figure it out, but do it, you know. So I'd say if we want to kind of spin this conversation for another 5 or 6 minutes, then let's take a break, and I'm going to go back in the back room and huddle with maybe any of you who want to help me assess what you've heard and what this sort of suggests in a revision of topics and who might be where and what. And then let's meet back here briefly at 12 to see if everybody's on the same page with the marching orders for the public program, and we'll have that done by 12:30 or 12. Does that make sense?
I definitely want to say some things before we're done this morning.
Pardon?
I definitely want to say some things before we're done this morning about this afternoon.
Yeah, okay. So does that work as a general game plan for how we, well, you know, I just want to make some space right now to see if, while this conversation topic is hot, whether anyone else has any input to it. Bree?
I think something is emerging around a lot of field of research around the existential crises that are happening in our world right now. And a big topic that has come up is communities of belonging, the absence of communities of belonging, the absence of these middle structures that so many of us have had that no longer are available to so many. It's not just our postmodern institutions that are failing us, right? most of our institutional structures, if not all of them, are dying and going through a transition. And then you have a generation that's being brought up for the first time with growing up with the internet, which is changing how we're understanding self. I can't identify as I'm part of this country. I belong to this tribe. I belong to this religion. Because now I have a sense of the planetary belonging that is actually my true belonging. And I no longer can fit into these shoes that are too small and are hurting my feet. And so you have this general profound malaise. And I wonder if part of the practical isn't part of what we've been dancing around, which is the identity of self. How do we find selfhood and personhood? And where is the refuge in communities, both present, planetary, and cosmic, that can allow us to provide the hope that so many aren't experiencing, on the day-to-day level? Having a sense that we're not in this alone. Like at a very practical level, what are we saying? You're not in this alone. We're going somewhere good. This can be trusted. There is a self underneath all of this anxiety of this other selfhood. So I think I'm wanting to kind of wrap my arms around the conversation of suffering selfhood and the refuge of relationality that can be trusted as being part of what I feel is kind of starting to cohere in some way.
So last night, Cynthia, you were talking about not having a rudder, or where is our hub, in a sense. And as you were speaking today, or all of us, this is the rudder, and finding that within the relationship with each other. I'm also hearing, just in the last few minutes, I think the word concreteness and making a plan, and Thomas saying, you figure it out. So, I don't know if that's somewhere we want to get to by the end of our time together, even tomorrow or today. But there's also a part of me that's saying, I just want to hang out here a little bit more in the beauty of what is here, and not rush to try to figure it out even. And I don't know what that means in terms of the plan. So I just want to put that out there.
I'm just remembering Thomas saying one time at a dialogue or something that he was ready to die and just melt back into the oneness. But then he said he realized he probably wouldn't get to do that even then. And so he had some little glimmer, some sense of continued servitude, servanthood. But I keep feeling, just even looking over at the picture there, however we understand that servanthood continuing in realms beyond or realms within, that the realized possibility, the ripened fruit of Thomas' life, of his presence, that, as Felina said, the grain of wheat, as the grain of wheat has fallen into the ground, that is now planted in the earth. It's planted in the psychic atmosphere of the world, what he was, what he bore. And so it's just there. It's just there now to attune to. And you can do it by just looking at his sweet face, and then you just feel, there, So I feel like if we wonder, how does he continue to teach us or aid us? Well, you just tune in, let his heart be planted in your heart, and then it continues to unfold and guide and teach from there. And that it's actually very easy. It's not sort of esoteric and strange, and it's just you tune in and his heart is still teaching, still unfolding, and it's very accessible. And this goes back to the energy of devotion from last night, that, devotion, where we direct our devotion is what we become. And if we're devoting ourselves to qualities of Thomas, we're actually awakening them in us. And so just that.
So what if we take a break till noon, and there will be, at 12:30, there'll be a real lunch, so you don't have to think that, oh my God, this is my time to eat everything I'm going to eat. I'm correct?
Yeah, you can pick away like for 5 minutes. They're going to start clearing it away at 1:45, and then there's a big, nice lunch that Barbara's organising downstairs at 12:30.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I'm going to go in the back room and listen a little bit to what I've heard. And Kabir, if you could join me for a minute, and Ed and anybody else who's really kind of, yeah.
And I thought of this at the very beginning. I just want to throw it out there, and it might not be possible, but in terms of the panels, personally, I think it'd be really wonderful if we had at least 2 women on each panel. So
Yeah.
I'm just going to kind of throw that out in the atmosphere.
Exactly, yeah. Certainly attention will be given, I mean, even the art form of panelings, but I would like as much as possible for us to make a consensual decision about how we go, with the understanding, too, that part of what we're going to be doing when we shift to the public dimension is to essentially bring some of our work in progress forward into the public. So some of the decisions on what are the actual titles of the panel and who's on them have to do with helping to bring other people on board with what we're doing too. And some of the decisions will be made around that. But I've got some stuff that's percolating that I want to reality test through a few people before I bring it to the whole. But we're all going to choose together how this material will go forth, and we'll do that from 12 to 12:25 or whatever long it takes. So take a good breath, Heather.
At the latest. I'll just say at this point, so we've got nearly 250 people shuffling in, and there's a ton of work to set up. So if we can be super sharp at 12:25, I'd really appreciate it. I might just say this now while we're doing logistics. When that time comes at 12:25, if you can take all your stuff with you, you can put it in the office where, on the left where you first came in, behind the front desk. You can leave all your stuff there. And then I just want to say, when we set up the chairs, as I said, there'll be all reserved seats for you guys. If you guys could all be here at 10 to 2, 10 minutes before 2, seated and kind of holding the space and the quiet, it will really help people just come into a prepared space. And the monks, there'll be 6 Buddhist monks coming, and they'll be sitting on cushions facing that way. So that's the working plan, and your food will be ready at 12:30. But
okay, perfect. Okay, for now, be back here at 12, quite promptly, so that we can get this cleaned up.